Hello, listeners. Just wanted to drop in and tell you that we are hard at work on Season 3 of Hidden Oaks. We don't have an official release date for that for you yet, but to give you a little something while you wait, we present a short story written within the world of Hidden Oaks, with more to follow. Stay tuned. And without further ado, One-Legged Jay's Unlucky Day by Owen Swerkstrom. Jay Duncan sat up and gasped in one full-body spasm. The ghastly, toothy smile from his nightmare followed his vision into waking, its ominous shape slowly dissolving over a succession of blinks. His dreams were either more vivid now, or he was remembering them more clearly since they'd lowered his dosage. His leg, his missing leg, always hurt for a good while after this particular nightmare. 3:33 a.m. Just enough time to get back to sleep before needing to wake up even less rested, he concluded. But his fatigue quickly overcame his worry, and he was sound asleep once more. "Jay! Hey, Jay, sorry to get you up early." An urgent whisper, a touch on the shoulder, and his sleep was shattered again. The single voice was his friend, his roommate, his co-worker, and at that specific moment, his greatest enemy. The one thing wedged between himself and a blissful slumber. He was explaining something about work, some important lead which he had to go and check out. The commander was waiting outside. What any of it had to do with him and the precious sleep he was missing went over Jay's head. "You'll have to take the bus, all right? I know you think you can drive now, but we're doing this by the book, okay?" He managed to nod and mumble enough to signal that he understood, and the voice left, quickly and quietly. When he woke up for the third time that day, he was as tired as he'd feared. His morning routine unfolded as a parody of itself. His pasty, unshaven face featured a beet-red pimple at the center of his nose. Jam spilled on his false leg's harness, and while he tried to scrub it clean, his shirt snagged and tore on a drawer handle. He considered grabbing J2's car keys, but decided he'd been right. J1 had ended up taking the bus before. He could bring his laptop and do a bit of work on the way. He smiled to himself about the names J1 and J2. At work, everybody called them Agent Duncan and Agent Wilker, but between themselves they had started going by number of legs. They'd considered renaming the cat J4 just to really bring home the theme. Not everybody would appreciate their sense of humor, but without laughs and sarcasm and being oneself with a close friend, what was the point of anything? The young man had been so wound up in his own thoughts that he'd made it out the door and within sight of the bus stop before realizing he'd forgotten his laptop after all. He was also within sight of the bus he'd just missed. At least, he thought after a moment of deflation, in this case, two wrongs could make a right. He turned around smoothly, a maneuver which not long ago might have resulted in toppling over and his false leg being a sharply literal pain in the ass. He had time to return home and grab his computer before the next bus would come by. When he reached the apartment, though, he remembered the keys, still sitting on the counter. Sure enough, he was locked out. There was a spare key above the light, a hiding place he had little trouble reaching back when both his legs were made of muscle and bone. This day was quite determined to mock him, Jay thought to himself. After some hasty improvisation, perhaps too hasty, he found himself balanced on a trash bin and still reaching beyond comfort before he got the key in hand. A miscalculated angle atop a misjudged center of gravity sent him falling and landing on the absence of a joint, to the dismay of his incomplete nervous system. He wasn't injured, and neither was his all-too-artificial leg, but it wouldn't seat quite right again from that moment on. The day's mockery continued. The laptop was not charged, its unique power cord evidently bitten through by the cat. He was just glad she hadn't chomped the other part of the cable instead. 120 volts would make quick work of 9 lives, he mused, while resolving to bring the laptop anyway and rig up something to charge it once he got to the lab. The dead battery was ultimately not a problem. The next bus was much more full than he expected, leaving him standing on his misfitting leg with no lap to top. Jay couldn't quite resolve those two particular wrongs into a right. Over the course of the ride, complete with not one but two detours, he developed a fairly robust headache to go with his phantom and real leg pains. Sweat collected on his brow and under his suit, serving as what he hoped was the final garnishing on his feast of discomfort. After limping from the bus and to the nondescript building, his identity card needed to be swiped 4 times before the lock agreed to disengage. His route to the lab presented no additional surprises or hurdles, which felt like a triumph. Before anything else, he quickly wired up a power source, booted up, plugged in, and began a transfer of his main working directories. The next time a morning threatened to go the way this one had, he was determined to be able to work from home. He watched for a moment as the file paths displayed on the terminal scrolled hypnotically by, before realizing that while his breathing may have settled down, his headache and leg had not. In the bathroom, Jay took his old full dosage. What it was a dose of, he didn't know. He was no chemist. Whether it contained steroids or stem cells or more illicit things still, he didn't know. But he did know he'd healed up in remarkable time and been in remarkably little pain before they'd suggested he take less. He was curious, of course, and would ask. Someday. His hunch was that he might not want the mystery medicine anymore if he knew what it was, but that wasn't going to happen today. His stomach let out an urgent grumble, and he fumbled his way into the handicap stall. Even if he'd had both legs, he'd have needed to grab the railings. He'd been stopped up before, but never so badly. He couldn't decide which were worse, the days he couldn't go or the days he could. This day turned out to be the latter, so before his injection could complete its magic, he had a long and excruciating bowel movement, followed by a long and humiliating cleanup process. He might have heard some commotion out in the lab, almost reminding him of a fire drill, except there weren't any alarms. To his great gratitude, none of the people passing by came in, and his rank and arduous shame at least remained private. When he was finally finished and washing up, it came to his attention that he hadn't heard anybody at all in a while. As he pulled down a paper towel, the room went dark. The emergency backup lights shined their feeble orange, casting lanky shadows for just a moment before cutting out and leaving the room in complete darkness. He fumbled his way to the door and had to push with surprising force to get it open. As he stumbled out, the door clamped shut on the top of his false leg, holding it tight. Try as he might, he could not pry the door open any further. He was reminded of an activated seatbelt, ratcheting tighter and refusing to let go until unbuckled and reset. Why or even how a men's room door might act like this was beyond his imagination. He called out into the darkness and waited, then called out again. But he was alone. After abandoning his leg, still clinched in the stubborn door, Jay felt and hopped his way down the hall back toward the lab, eventually finding and following a glow from his laptop screen. He cobbled together a battery which would give him more time, and a flashlight which would be less clumsy to aim and carry than his hefty Pentium 2 laptop. It was hardly MacGyver-level improvisation, he thought, but there was nobody around to impress. After trying and failing to open or unlock or override a door, any door, his attention turned to figuring out why or where everybody had gone. His was the only computer still running, and his data transfer had been cut short, but he began digging through. Schematic files, simulation results, contact lists, scans of some kind of hand-drawn map, microcontroller code. It didn't take him long to find the top priority message which had been sent to all agents. His heart sank as he read. The words felt surreal. His stomach felt like it had when the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded. His eyes skimmed over and over the words. Entranced, he opened the message source and kept staring. Something felt off. Some quick checking seemed to confirm what his gut feared. Somebody had forged a message superseding Order Zero. Not only was everybody going to Hidden Oaks Park, the epicenter of the craziness from which they all worked to protect the area, but they were going there because of a lie. Jay double and triple checked, ran the signature and checksum through every possible validation he could think of. It wasn't authentic. Mira's worries about a takeover, a coup, this must have been it. He had to tell her, or Friedman, or anybody, but to do that, he had to get out. After exhausting his efforts at the doors, he looked around for any other option. His makeshift flashlight found a roll of retroreflective tape sitting on the table in what the guys called Thane's Corner. He'd never met any Thane, but supposed he was once an engineer there, just like him. A loose tangle of network and telephone cables ran up from the desk into the torn corner of a foam ceiling panel. With one leg and no crutch, walking was cumbersome. Climbing was difficult. Crawling around on top of cinder blocks in the dark was pure agony. Jay's knee quickly became as miserable as he was himself. He could tell he had reached the server room, but wasn't sure what to do next. A spider, no doubt one of many within the ceiling, chose that moment to descend onto his neck. It felt like a walnut touching and then crawling on his flesh. His startled, panicked swats at the leathery creature led to flailing and losing his already tenuous balance. With a dusty crack, he fell through a panel and onto a rack of networking and diagnostic equipment. The rigid, sparse structure absorbed his momentum and, suddenly top-heavy, immediately tipped over. The rack struck the wall and his improvised flashlight fell away from him. As it hit the floor, its light ceased, and from the small scattering sounds that followed, he guessed it would not shine again, even if he were to climb down and feel around for it. For a minute, Jay clung to the rack, at an angle but disoriented enough to have very little notion of his position or distance from the floor. As his eyes adjusted, he could make out subtle lines of light. Timid groping toward it indicated there was a large air conditioning vent on the wall just in front of him. With one leg and while perched precariously on a steel rack, fishing a Swiss Army knife out of his pocket was awkward. Feeling around in the dark for screws and getting them removed was a small miracle. Gathering up the nerve to crawl into the thin sheet metal ductwork after falling through a ceiling, and while every movement of dust or hair felt like a spider, was just about where Jay was ready to draw the line. It wasn't a good idea, but if he had any hope of stopping his fellow agents from following that bogus order, he had no choice. He found himself falling once more, dropping through a weakly connected section of ventilation shaft and down into blinding daylight. He fell into some kind of mesh which also gave way and then landed gut first on a ground-fixed utility box. He curled into a fetal position, gasping, his wind knocked out. He'd only experienced such a thing once before, and that had been plenty. In his struggle to get upright again, a springy branch delivered a sharp thwack to the zit on his nose, which felt like it must have been linked to every major nerve in his body. Shaking off tunnel vision and slowly, painfully, gasping his way back to functional breath, he lumbered his way to a locked gate. From the inside, however, and with more than ample light, it was trivial to find and remove enough of a panel to slip out. Looking back, he supposed it wouldn't have been much more of a hassle to get in. It was certainly good to know that the agency's most sensitive data was so impregnably protected. The thought sent Jay spinning. Why hadn't he looked around the server room for backup tapes or anything? Just like the keys that morning, his mind flashed to his laptop, still in the lab. Why hadn't he at least grabbed a disk with the forged message in his analysis? That would all have to wait. Right now, he needed to find Friedman or Tanner or Mira. Mira and J2 were at that moment pulling into the main parking lot. With all his remaining strength, J1 hopped toward their car. This was it. He knew it. This had to be his day finally turning around. After all his rotten luck, he could stop the coup and save his agency. The piles of wrongs would finally make some kind of right. The commander herself was just meters away now. She and J2, or rather Agent Wilker, would help. They'd know what to do. One-legged Jay's unlucky day would have all been worth it. He could feel it. The Hidden Oaks podcast is a collaboration between Patrick W. Marsh, Robert Dawn, and Owen Swerkstrom. The story, One-Legged Jay's Unlucky Day, written by Owen Swerkstrom. The voice of Hidden Oaks, performed by Robert Dawn. Original music composed and performed by David Schwartz. Find more of his works at dtschwartz.com. Produced by Robert Dawn, Owen Swerkstrom, and Patrick W. Marsh. You can find out more online by visiting us at hiddenoakspodcast.com or by finding us on Twitter at Hidden Oaks Pod, as well as Facebook and Instagram at Hidden Oaks Podcast. Hidden Oaks is an Ironfield independent production. Thank you for listening, and until next time.